Okay, welcome to the Hot Topics lecture series of 2019. We have lectures every Tuesday and every Thursday, except in exceptional cases where there will be an announcement. The CLE credit of 1 credit is awarded today. You have to sign in at the attendance roster at the back of the room. There's also a Hot Topics roster at the back of the room. Please pick one of those up. This is, as always, a brown bag lunch. I see many of you are already busily eating your lunch. That's a good thing. Tim will complete his presentation around 12:45, and there will be time for Q&A. So please prepare your questions. It is my great pleasure to introduce Tim Eichenberg, who's a member of the VLS summer faculty. Indeed, he has been co-teaching our Ocean and Coastal Law course here at the law school for 19 years. He is an environmental lawyer and a consultant and a long-time personal friend of mine. He is on the board of the San Francisco Baykeeper. He previously served as chief counsel of the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, which did path-breaking work in developing sea level adaptation regulations, which he will be discussing. He has broad experience in California and in Washington prior to that, working with such organizations as the California Coastal Commission, the Ocean Conservancy, Oceana, the Marine Law Institute, and others. He is a co-author of the ABA book on ocean and coastal law and policy, and I am going to leave it at that. Tim, thank you.
Thank you, John. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Tim Eichenberg, as John has explained to you. I'm a member of the summer faculty and very grateful that I'm not here in the winter. Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about an effort that I was involved in to try to address the effects of climate change and sea level rise in San Francisco Bay. And with the hopes that some of you that are working on these issues will learn some of the lessons that we learned, some of the pitfalls that we fell into, and have success in trying to deal with this very important problem about adapting to changing climate and sea level rise. But first, I want to give you a little history about San Francisco Bay. Today, the bay is about 1/3 smaller than it was prior to the gold rush in 1860. The filling of San Francisco Bay started in Yerba Buena Cove 170 years ago. This is what North Beach in San Francisco, if any of you have been there, this is what North Beach looked like in about 1848, as it says in this slide. And this is what it looked like 3 or 4 years later because of the gold rush. And the filling started just a couple of years later when the ships that were going around the Cape Horn to bring the miners to San Francisco to search for gold were abandoned in this cove. Many were abandoned and ended up rotting as dry hulks into what is now North Beach and became fill. And many of them, others were brought onto shore and they ended up being hotels and restaurants and jails and many other unsavory type activities that San Francisco became famous for when it was called the Barbary Coast. Between 1850 and 1960, 4 square miles of San Francisco Bay was filled every year. This is done for development by local towns and counties to provide more land for development and to fill and to use as a landfill because they had so much trash. 19 million cubic yards of fill was used to create Treasure Island right in the middle of San Francisco Bay for the 1939 World's Fair. And the fair was a huge success, but the filling didn't stop there. They filled tidal marshes to build salt ponds and for development. And 90% of the bay's tidal marshes were destroyed and filled up to the present time, and have been destroyed and filled up to the present time. And this is not a modern art painting, but this is an overview of what San Francisco Bay looks like recently. Much of the shoreline looked like this. There was only 4 miles of public access provided to folks that were adjoining the bay. Then, fed up with the situation filling and the threats to the bay, 3 women, Esther Gullick, that are pictured here, Esther Gullick, Catherine Kerr, and Sylvia McLaughlin, formed a group called Save the Bay, which exists to this day. And they lobbied to create a state agency to develop a plan to protect San Francisco Bay. And this agency, to prevent the bay from becoming a river, and this is a map of what they had in their logo to show that the Army Corps of Engineers was preparing a plan and projecting that with the fill that was currently being done at 4 square miles a year, the bay was going to look like a river by the year 2020, which is next year. So in order to prevent that, they lobbied to create a state agency called the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, BCDC. And BCDC became the first coastal management agency in the nation in 1965, a long time ago. So what are the duties of BCDC, the organization that I used to work for? They prepared a plan to try to deal with filling of the bay and to provide public access in not just San Francisco Bay, but also the adjoining bays of Sissoon Marsh. And they also prepared special area plans to deal with special areas to try to protect those areas. They had regulatory authority in the bay and 100 feet from mean high tide line, which was called the shoreline band. So they only had 100 feet of jurisdiction above mean high tide. And in that area, they could prohibit bay fill except for public access and net dredging and water-related uses. And they could require what the statute said was maximum feasible public access. And they could also implement their federal coastal zone management program for the bay. They also had enforcement authority to issue fines and civil penalty orders for violations of the McAteer-Petrus Act, which was the act that created BCDC, and for Marsh Act. The Marsh Act also applied under their jurisdiction for the Sissoon Marsh, which is to the east of the bay. And they also could enforce and levy fines for violations of the law for people that filled without a permit or that didn't provide maximum feasible public access for new development. So over the past 50 years, Bay Conservation and BCDC has reduced fill from about 4 square miles a year before it was created to just a few acres a year this year, up to the present time, and that's only for public access and other water-related uses. They've opened up a lot of the diked tidal marshes that were diked up for salt pond development, and they opened them up to the bay. So that today the bay is about 27 square miles larger than it was before BCDC was created. They've stored 40,000 acres of tidal marsh through these restoration projects, and there's a plan to restore about 31,000 more as part of a plan to restore up to 100,000 acres of tidal marshes that were filled and diked off prior to 1965. And they increased public access from 4 miles to 200 miles, as 200 miles are available public access today. So that has been their mandate, and they've done fairly well at doing that. So the mission's been accomplished, right? And we can all take pride in what BCDC accomplished, but now the bay is facing new threats. And we know that there's skeptics, people don't believe in climate change. But now there's really sound scientific evidence that the climate is changing and is actually getting warmer. And that sea levels are rising whether you believe in climate change or not. I'm not going to go into the science behind this slide. We know that the sea levels are rising because the oceans are getting warmer. That's a fact. And when the oceans get warmer, oceans expand, and so sea level is rising with that expansion. We also know that the ice caps are melting, both in the Arctic and the Antarctic and Greenland, at accelerating rates. We know that storms are increasing in intensity, which is increasing the effects of sea level rise. We know that there's less runoff. The droughts are creating less runoff. With less runoff, there's less sediment into the marine environment, which is also exacerbating the causes of erosion. When there's less sediment, there's more erosion. And when there's droughts, as there has been in the Bay Area for many years now, there's excessive groundwater withdrawal and pumping, and that creates subsidence. And when the land is going down and the oceans are going up, that's going to even make the situation worse. So we all know these things are happening. We know that there's strange events are happening. Icebergs are breaking off and floating down into Nova Scotia, and global temperatures are projected to be hotter than they've ever been in the last 14 million years. And when we know that carbon levels were this high 3.5 million years ago, when it was this high, the oceans were 60 feet higher than they are today. So we know that the oceans are rising, we just don't know how fast it's going to happen. We also know that in the Arctic sea ice has been shrinking at a rate of 21,000 square miles a year since the year 1970. We also know that the Antarctic sea ice sheet, Antarctic ice, is melting 3 times faster than it was in 2007. And we also know that the Greenland ice sheets are melting 5 times faster than they were in 1970. So we know that sea level is rising, and we fear that it may be rising at even accelerated rates. In the Bay Area in California, where I'm from, climate change has also reduced the Sierra snowpack. We've had severe droughts over the last 5 or 6 years, and that was a source of a lot of fresh water during the hot summers when it doesn't rain at all in California. This is what some of the major reservoirs look like before and after the drought. This Orville Dam is the nation's tallest dam, and this is what the reservoir behind Orville Dam looked like in 2015 during the middle of the drought. Folsom Lake is another major reservoir that has shrunk to a trickle in 2014. And these droughts have also caused massive fires. You've probably read about those that happened this last winter in the fall, and it happened in a time when it usually rains, but the whole state was basically on fire. The fires burned, there were 8,527 fires in California last year. They burned 1.8 million acres of land. They destroyed 18,000 structures, and they killed nearly 100 people. So the drought and the climate change has had tremendous effects in not just the Bay Area, but all over California. Some of the communities in and around the Bay Area looked like this. This is a picture of what Santa Rosa looked like after fire went through. And even in San Francisco, which was not part of the major fires, we had to wear masks for several weeks this fall because the smoke was so thick that it was very hazardous to folks' health, especially if you had asthma and other diseases. I even bought, I have like 3 masks at home just in case. This year we've had record rains. We had a record snowpack. So the drought is over, and at least for this year. So we're real pleased about that. That's the good news. The bad news is we have major floods. I mean, what's next, right? Pestilence and earthquakes, I suppose. The flooding has been very severe. Many of the communities around some of the rivers in and around the Bay Area look like this during this winter. And so these are some of the conditions that have exhibited themselves in the Bay Area that we think they're related to climate change and global warming. And that is all going to be contributing to sea level rise. And sea level rise has already been occurring in San Francisco Bay over the last century. The last century, the sea levels have risen in the bay 7 inches between 1900 and 2000, even before climate change was even being considered. And we know that because the nation's oldest tidal gauge is right underneath the Golden Gate Bridge. But projections that were made 10 years ago believe that that San Francisco Bay is going to rise between 16 and 55 inches by the year, 16 inches by the year 2050, and 55 inches by the year 2100. And those projections were done in 2009. And now that we have new information about melting ice caps and so forth, we think that that might actually be a conservative estimate. In addition to the sea level rises, there's been dramatic subsidence because with the drought, there's been excessive groundwater pumping, which has reduced the land levels, and that's been going on for many years as well. excessive groundwater pumping has been going on even before climate change was a concept, just to water the agriculture that's been in the Central Valley and in and around the Bay Area. So you can see how far some of this subsidence has gone. So with increased storm intensity, just a 16-inch rise in sea levels by 2050 could make the 100-year floodplains an annual event in San Francisco Bay. So that's what some of the effects of the sea level rise will be. It will exacerbate areas like the 100-year floodplains. And this map shows that the area that's subject to high tide with a 16 inches of sea level rise by the year 2050 coincides almost directly with the current 100-year floodplain. So that doesn't bode well for the Bay Area. The good news is that by the year 2100, the Bay will look kind of like it did back before the gold rush. It will be restored to its current status. The bad news is that we've built a lot of stuff on fill in the Bay Area, especially in San Francisco, and that sea level rise could end up making it look like this, unless precautions are taken. San Francisco is protected by this aging seawall. It's 140 years old, not in terribly good shape. And so right now, this is a picture of the seawall during a king tide or an extra high tide. What's it going to look like when sea level rises, and what's going to happen to that seawall? Downtown San Francisco looks like this now with every really major high tide. And there is this seawall extends for about 3 miles. It would take hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars to repair, and that's the city is now undergoing studies to see how they can do that, to either raise it or to fix it, so to accommodate with these new estimates of sea level rise. But it's going to be a full employment project for the city for years to come. And around the Bay, we've constructed lots of stuff on fill. Major highways are on fill, railroads are on fill, major office buildings and airports are on fill, major development and residential housing is all on fill, and all these areas are very close to sea level and are going to be subject to inundation unless measures are taken to do something about it. So back in the year, about 10 years ago, BCDC, the agency that I was working for, produced some maps to show what areas would be subject to, would be vulnerable to a 1 foot rise, a 1 meter rise, excuse me, a 3 foot rise in sea level by the year 2100. And these maps were produced, they showed that San Francisco International Airport would be vulnerable to a 3 foot rise in sea levels by the year 2100. And so people said, well, that's okay, we have another airport in Oakland, right? But Oakland is also subject to the same thing. And then people got really nervous when we took the maps and applied them to Silicon Valley. Because Silicon Valley is a precious resource of where all the tech companies are. And these shows all the tech companies that are vulnerable in this red zone to sea level rise in 55-inch level for the red and the 16-inch for the pale red. And these would include tech companies like Google, Yahoo, Oracle, Dell, Cisco, Intel, the big ones, the big tech companies are all ringing the Bay in the Silicon Valley area and are going to be vulnerable. And this includes the Facebook campus. So you can see it's surrounded by wetlands and would be very vulnerable. But they have a lot of money, so I'm sure they can figure something out. And they have all our personal information, so they know what we know. So the potential inundation of by 2050 of a 16-inch rise would be about 180,000 acres, or 281 square miles. And by 2100 would be about 213,000 acres, about 332 square miles of the bay. And people have done studies to figure out how much that would cost, and the replacement value of the structures that are vulnerable is about $62 billion. This was done 10 years ago, so I'm sure it's a lot higher now. And that's almost double what the whole state of California would be subject to, because San Francisco Bay is so much more vulnerable than the rest of the state because we built so much on fill in and around the bay. So what can we do about it? Well, we could ignore the problem until it becomes a crisis, which is what's happening pretty much around the country and in the world. Or we could adapt the way they do in Venice when there's a high tide. They just put on their hip waders and go shopping. We could build structures that move easily. That might be a good strategy. Or we could construct structures that are resilient to sea level rise. And you better be in good shape to walk up to your house. Or we could build seawalls around our major cities, as they do in some areas in Europe. But Californians love their beaches, and beaches destroy, you can either have a choice. You either have a seawall or a beach. It's very difficult to have both at the same time. So folks in California are really not that anxious to do that if they can avoid it. We could build levees, and that's probably going to happen. The levees are really necessary, but we've seen what's happened to levees in the New Orleans area. Levees are extremely vulnerable, and they're not a permanent solution. And they give people the impression that if you're living behind a levee, that you're safe, and you're really not. A better strategy may be to remove development that's in harm's way, or retreat, as they say. Nobody likes that word, but that's a good strategy. And let wetlands migrate inland, because wetlands are about as close to a silver bullet to deal with rising sea levels as you get. First of all, they sequester carbon. They also adapt naturally to sea level rise by increasing, as long as there's enough sediment in the marine environment, they will actually migrate inland and help absorb floodwaters. And they also reduce the need to build costly seawalls and levees. So that might be a better strategy and a more cost-effective strategy in the long run, although people are very reluctant to remove structures and let wetlands move inland. The problem with BCDC, the agency that's supposed to deal with this issue in the bay, is that it was created to address a shrinking bay, not an expanding bay. It was created to stop fill in the bay and to protect resources below mean high tide. But it only has very limited authority over a narrow 100-foot shoreline band, 100 feet above mean high tide. It doesn't make it very useful for trying to deal with wetlands that need to migrate inland. Most of the land use in the Bay Area, too, is under the authority that's amongst 55 local governments. So doing anything bay-wide is going to run into these jurisdictional issues about how to deal with all these different cities and counties that have jurisdiction in and around the bay. And the BCDC also lacks the authority to prohibit development in these vulnerable areas, to address flood protection above 100 feet above mean high tide outside the shoreline band, to facilitate the inland marsh migration of wetlands, and to regulate greenhouse gases. We have no authority to do that, or we had no authority to do that when I was working there. And 100 feet of shoreline band jurisdiction is not going to help Silicon Valley tech companies. As you can see in this slide here, just a small ring around the bay here is not going to help these other companies that are in this blue area that are going to be, they're threatened by what happened. Why did it do that? Source? It says it's cooling, no source. I know, what did I say, to offend somebody?
Well, it might need a second to reboot. Can I wait here and monitor this? I think it's going through a shutdown process.
Yeah, it is
so
going through a
it might take a
shutdown.
minute to bring it back up
Right.
again.
Should I press this projector?
No, I think it's going to need a second to finish.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, I have the slides here on my computer, but you can't see them.
Hold on.
You did it.
Let me just wait and make sure it comes up.
See, the projector should be going on, right? I think it happened when I
It's
touched
warming
this
up
thing.
now. Oh, well, that would be nice.
Yeah.
Don't touch it.
I'm not going to touch that. That mouse. That mouse was.
Sorry, Facebook.
Mark Zuckerberg is watching us all. So as I was saying that shoreline band's not going to help Silicon Valley, and everything shut down. Fortunately, California is doing a lot on mitigation, on reducing greenhouse gas emissions. A number of bills have been passed to reduce vehicle emissions and greenhouse gases. But very little has been done to try to deal to adaptation, to adapting to sea level rise, which seems to be a thornier problem for some reason. Maybe because it involves people's lifestyles immediately. So what BCDC did with their limited authority, they had a design competition to see what creative ideas people had to try to deal with resilient development in and around the bay to deal with rising sea levels. And they got some pretty crazy ideas. One was a ventilated levee. And I'm not sure how this would work, but it looks like with rising sea levels, the water would fall into this levee, but it doesn't really tell you where it would go. Also, another idea was to build a bladder. This has been tried in other places, to build a bladder under the Golden Gate Bridge and raise the bladder when sea levels were high tides were coming in to try to protect inundation of the bay. This is also not a really good idea because when there's water coming down and water coming in, you're going to end up with even worse flooding because it's going to back up behind the bladder. But more recently, there's been some other designs that have been seem to have a better idea about how to deal with this situation, like building barrier islands in the bay to try to protect important resources. And these barrier islands would serve a dual purpose. First of all, they would stop, sea level rises from inundating certain areas, but they also provide recreational opportunities to people to enjoy the bay. And the same thing with the salt ponds, convert these salt ponds that have been constructed all over the bay and make them act as like sponges to deal with rising sea levels and sequester that and also create recreational opportunities and habitat for wildlife. So that seems like a much better idea than some of these other crazy ideas. So when I joined BCDC back when they were in the middle of trying to amend their what's called the Bay Plan, and they were amending it to try to deal with these issues that we were just talking about. And so when I got there, we started listening to the stakeholder concerns. We wanted to find out what people were concerned about before we amended the plan to try to deal with this issue. And we were inundated with all kinds of concerns. The environmentalists wanted to make sure that there was no habitat loss with rising sea levels and that the beaches were being protected. The business community was concerned about over-regulation. They were afraid the BCDC was going to regulate them too much and that we're going to restrict development. The local governments were concerned that we were going to, they were concerned about losing local control over this bay, that they have jurisdiction over. The unions were concerned about loss of jobs and economic opportunities. And the environmental justice community was very concerned that areas of the bay where they were living, low-lying areas, the poor areas, were going to be abandoned, and there was going to be an investment in those communities. Those communities were going to be abandoned. So we had to deal with all these concerns when we were developing our plan. And the policies evolved over a period of a couple of years. We did produce those maps that I showed you that showed the vulnerability. A climate adaptation strategy was adopted statewide. The environmental groups lobbied to restrict development, in this area. That's what they wanted us to do, just try to stop development from in hazardous areas. And the business community launched an intense campaign accusing BCDC of a power grab. Like we wanted more jurisdiction, wanted more than 100 feet of jurisdiction. And that they also said that we were going to abandon these poor communities to try to get opposition to what we were trying to do. Interestingly enough, well, this is an aside, that the lead lawyer for the business groups that were opposing this is now the chair of the Bay Conservation and Development Commission, appointed by Governor Jerry Brown. Anyway, that's an aside. The policies evolved. The hearings were postponed because of all these concerns, and we had to go out and reach out to these local communities. We did 35 meetings in different local governments to talk about some of these concerns, even after we proposed we started holding hearings on the proposal for these policies, and we had to stop the hearings and go back out to local governments and local groups and organizations to explain how these policies would affect them or not affect them. And we did shuttle diplomacy between the different competing interests, and by 2011, we got unanimous approval before a 27-member commission that BCDC has. They had 27 different commissioners. The commissioners represent all the state, local all the local government entities and interests in and around the bay. And the press reported that these were historic policies that were adopted to deal with climate change and sea level rise, but they also noted that it was significantly less ambitious than it was originally planned, and I'm going to explain a little bit what they meant by that. So some of the highlights of what these policies contain. They require permits to be based on risk assessments of the best estimates of future sea level rise and flood projections. So now when somebody comes in for a permit, they have to show that their project is going to be resilient to these projections. Projects must be built resilient to the 2050 projections of 16 inches and adaptable to the 2100 sea level rise projections. The restoration of tidal marshes and mudflats must be adaptable to sea level rise. A lot of these wetlands that are going through extensive restoration efforts are going to be inundated. So we have to deal with the specter of spending all this money on restoring wetlands that are going to be flooded soon and have no effect. So we have to figure out a way to deal with that, and that's part of these policies. Shoreline protection must withstand projected sea level rise and use natural features. Public access must remain viable to sea level rise, so maximum feasible public access that BCDC requires. When they provide it, they have to show how it's going to be adaptable to existing sea level rise. Not that it's great to provide an access way in front of your structure, but if it's going to be underwater in 5 or 10 years or 20 years, you have to have an alternate plan to provide public access. And also, a financial strategy must minimize public burdens. So for major development, they have to propose that a way in which the public burdens would be minimized with sea level rise threatened that development that was being permitted. And a regional strategy was initiated to deal with sea level rise throughout the entire bay to protect critical areas and guide development and or figure out what areas that we should abandon or retreat from. And Bay Conservation Development Commission could not develop this regional plan by itself. It needed to have the participation of all the local towns and counties and interest groups and state agencies and federal agencies that were involved. So this has to be a regional strategy with all the players providing a blueprint for how to deal with this on a bay-wide basis. So what's some of these compromises that were made that were not as ambitious as we like? We had to revise language that discouraged or limited development in low-lying areas and instead replaced it with language that encouraged resilient development. So it's like two sides of a coin. The coin that we proposed initially was to discourage or limit development in these low-lying areas. That didn't go over very well. Instead, we said we want to encourage resilient development. So instead of being negative, it was expressed as a positive. Don't know, I kind of like the negative better, but that's one of the compromises that were made. The policies were changed to allow shoreline protection for new projects in vulnerable areas. Previously, shoreline protection was going to be prohibited for new development, and the authority of BCDC under the Coastal Zone Management Act and the Federal Consistency Authority and under the California Environmental Quality Act had to be waived in order to get these policies through, which was a bitter pill for some of the groups to swallow. The policies encourage wetland migration and protection in vulnerable areas instead of requiring wetland migration, or it was encouraged. So the language was weakened a little bit. They removed mention of using the precautionary approach. For some of you international lawyers, you know what that is. The initial draft of the policies promoted the findings promoted using a precautionary approach to dealing with development. That was taken out. It was deemed to be a red word, a bad word. And projects that were to be encouraged were listed specifically. And those projects were infill in areas near transit. So that was to show that there were also some positive things that were being proposed in these new policies. So some of the lessons that we learned that we hope that can be transferred to other folks that are working on this. that never underestimate the human tendency to shoot the messenger when you're coming with bad news. And those maps that were released were probably not a good idea because that was bad news for a lot of people. So we underestimated the effect of those inundation maps that were released. Business opposition and lobbying, nobody thought that the business community would rise up against these policies the way that they did. We thought that being in the Bay Area, they'd be a little bit more progressive. The toxic words like limit, discourage, precautionary, even the use of words like making recommendations were not perceived as being helpful when we were trying to propose these policies. So there might be other ways, more diplomatic ways of talking about some of these things. The public hearings that were scheduled on these were inadequate and insufficient, that there had to be more outreach. Instead of telling people to come into the hearings before the commission should have gone out and talked to them. We found that would have been a much better approach, and actually that's what ended up happening. Partnerships are extremely important. You can't do this stuff alone. You need to have good partners. The environmental community ended up being a very good, strong partner. Some of the federal agencies were good partners. Some of them were not good partners. And so partnerships are extremely important. Timing is everything. This was being proposed in 2008, 2009 during one of the worst economic downturns since the Great Depression. That was not helpful for trying to tell folks that they should be restricting development when everybody was hurting financially. So the timing was bad. And there was a resistance, even in a progressive area like the Bay Area, to innovative strategies, things like development moratoria, like let's not build in hazardous places until we can figure out, get better. That was not, that was being resisted. Resistance to the precautionary approach, resistance to things like rolling easements to get public access, waivers of seawalls, that resistance to that. The Coastal Commission requires that when anybody builds along the coast now that may be subject to erosion or sea level rise, that they waive the right to build a seawall. That didn't go over big in the Bay Area. Nevertheless, I think it was a positive effort. It initiated a very valuable discussion about climate change and sea level rise. People agreed on the projections of 16 to 55 inches. Everybody agreed to that part of it. They initiated a regional adaptation planning strategy, which was good. They achieved consensus on long-range projections, and led to detailed guidance in the coastal zone, along the ocean, outside the bay. And now we're at the point now where BCDC is going to have to apply these policies to some of the controversial developments. There's a proposal to build 8,000 units of housing, 250,000 square feet of offices, 350-foot office towers, and 3 hotels on Treasure Island that was built on fill previously that I showed you that slide when back in the 30s it was built for Treasure Island. Now they want to build this big development on it, and you can see that they've already built in some buffer zones, wetland buffer zones, to try to deal with sea level rise. So this development is now going to be is going to have to comply with these new guidelines. The conversion of salt ponds now, especially in the Redwood City area, a Cargill company that used to operate these salt ponds to produce salt is proposing to build 12,000 units of housing in this area, 1 million square feet of offices on these salt ponds, which are located right around sea level. The environmental community is opposing the development. They would like to restore it to tidal marsh as it was before. It was diked off. The EPA now has changed its mind. The EPA now says that the Clean Water Act does not apply to this development, which is a very interesting about face. They said the original EPA in 2010 said that this area was covered by the Clean Water Act because it was adjacent to navigable waters. It was a special aquatic site, and that it had under normal circumstances would contain vegetation that was adaptable to wet soils conditions. And that decision was reversed. So now this development is not going to have to comply with the Clean Water Act, which is going to be a problem. And then finally, the Golden State Warriors were going to build their new arena in the bay, right underneath the Bay Bridge. That was their proposal. And then when our policies were adopted and they came in and talked to the staff at BCDC, they changed their mind and decided this is what it was going to look like when it was finished underneath the bay. It was called an iconic structure. But after going through the policies and talking to the Army Corps of Engineers about an environmental impact statement and talking about how much it would cost to shore up and construct in the bay on these aging piers underneath the Bay Bridge, they decided to move their arena down south out of BCDC's jurisdiction. It is beyond 100 feet from mean high tide, so they don't have to deal with these policies anymore. Okay, exactly 45 minutes. How's that for perfect? Thank you very much.
If we could take questions using this microphone, it would really help capture the questions on our video. And bear with me, because I am but one person with one microphone.
Or just speak loudly.
Dean McHenry, absolutely not.
Tim, thanks so much. As a Californian, that was really both fun and interesting and terrifying to watch.
Especially
I
the
guess
fires, right?
I have sort of a two-part question, which is, number one, how much of what you've learned in looking at this extrapolates to the rest of the world? I'm sure you've thought about that. And number two, if it can't be done here in the Bay Area, arguably the richest pocket of the world, it certainly can't be done anywhere else.
Right. Well, I think it can be done, and I think it extrapolates to first world countries, These are first world problems for us, for the people in the Bay Area, because we have the resources to deal with this. Whether we have the will to deal is another question. And you'd think, as you said, that it would be that these policies would have been more, people would have been, especially businesses, would have been more receptive to it. I think they were receptive to the idea, but when the idea was put into words and regulations and restrictions, then people started to get cold feet about it. And I think it's going to be a challenge, to whatever community wants to do something about it, to deal with folks that are going to have to change the way that their lifestyles. Some folks are going to have to move away from the coast. Some folks are going to have to give up plans to develop along the coast. Some folks are going to have to pay more taxes to build seawalls. And like the seawall in downtown San Francisco is 3 miles long. Can you imagine how much that's going to cost to raise that? It has to be raised, or something has to be done. They're not going to abandon downtown San Francisco. The other issue is, which communities are going to be abandoned and which ones are going to be protected. So that's an awesome decision to make. The decision goes far beyond a state agency like BCDC. There has to be consensus on this. No one agency can say, let's abandon San Jose, the Alviso Creek area, which is a very poor area of San Jose, because it's actually a foot below sea level anyway. And it might make sense to abandon it, but maybe it's not politically possible to do something like that. So there's going to be a lot of challenges. I think some of the lessons that we learned are replicable in other areas, and I hope that people will learn something from it and not make the same mistakes that were made, back 10 years ago when these policies were proposed.
Thank you so much for being here. Reference to consensus and also it potentially being the richest pocket of the world bring up the question of, there are certainly questions of micro environmental justice, and I don't mean to be at all insensitive to them, but there is sort of this elephant in the room of the macro question of, we as a collective society, what really justifies spending many billions of dollars increasingly for the eternity, without an end in sight, on preservation of a fairly isolated, extraordinarily wealthy community, while the rest of the world grapples with questions about climate refugee and resettlement generally.
I know. You think about what the resources that are available to the Bay Area, especially San Francisco, with all the tech companies there, and then you think about places like Bangladesh that are getting inundated and will disappear, and some of the island nations that are going to disappear off the face of the earth. Those are equity questions that are beyond my pay grade. I don't know how to deal with them. I think I think the politics is local. You know, I don't think you can do it on a macro scale. You know, I think you have to roll up your sleeves and work at the state and local government levels and town halls and in the communities in which you live and deal with it there. But dealing with it, I don't think there's like one policy you can apply to all these different areas. It has to be done individually. And these decisions about these really profound decisions about what areas to protect and what areas to abandon have to be done by consensus unless we have a dictator that's going to tell us what to do. And I don't think anybody, you know, in this country would want somebody to tell them that they have to leave there, you know, which makes it very difficult to do. And the Coastal Commission and BCDC have a very difficult job in trying to make sensible decisions that are maybe cost effective but are politically unpopular. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was my rant about this.
So full disclosure, I live in Oakland. I'm just here for the summer.
You live in Oakland?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think this sort of goes along with the questions that have been asked, but how much did you have to deal with and I guess when you're doing this in 2008, 2009, it might have been less of a big deal, but the housing crisis and how that is sort of one of the biggest local political issues. And I mean, you're talking about North Beach maybe having to be abandoned because that's all infill, and North Beach is one thing, but when you're talking about the infill communities and East Oakland and Hayward, that's a very different environmental justice question. So sort of how you grappled with that and the political implications of everyone in the Bay Area is on board with trying to stop the housing crisis, but the biggest, and also the homelessness crisis in conjunction with those two things. I'm talking about the richest community in the area in the world. I mean, I get that, but if you don't live there, you also don't understand the massive amount of poverty that coexists with that too. So sort of how you balance those things.
Could you rephrase your question?
So I guess how much did you have to deal with the local politics surrounding housing and all of that?
The whole thing was about local politics. You know, it was those concerns that I talked about. The different interest groups had different concerns, and you know, what was really troubling was some people were provoking the environmental justice community to think that this was a conspiracy, you know, to try to abandon those areas, and there was a conspiracy to try to make sure that there wasn't investment in those areas that they were desperately needed, like Richmond and Alviso and East Oakland, West Oakland. So they were, like the business community, in my opinion, was cynically using those arguments to try to stop these policies from getting adopted, and that was the last thing that anybody intended to do. You know, we basically just trying to. I think the two, you know, major things that we were trying to do in these policies. The one is bring it to people's attention that something's going to have to be changed or something's going to have to be done. We can't just keep putting our head in the sand like that slide did. And this is happening. And the second thing is that we need to get together to form a plan, and that plan can't be done in a unilateral way. It has to be done through consensus, and groups have to get together and to organize, you know, a regional strategy to make these decisions. It can't be done unilaterally.
One more question.
Thank you for this. Putting political will aside for a moment, do you think that there's any national solution that could make local consensus building easier?
Well, there are some programs that, like the Coastal Management Program, the CZMA, could be provided resources to do that. Right now, the CZMA is woefully underfunded. They give a paltry several $1 million to every state that has a coastal management program. And each coastal management program is supposed to deal with climate change and sea level rise. But this isn't just a coastal problem, but that's my focus is on the coastal zone. But that's one thing they could do, is they could fund these programs to deal with this better. I don't think this is being done on a statewide basis up and down the coast. The Coastal Commission, California Coastal Commission has jurisdiction of the ocean portion, and BCDC has jurisdiction of just the bay. but, and the Coastal Commission has the authority to approve local coastal plans. These are plans that each county and city that has a jurisdiction in the coastal zone can prepare in order to take over permit authority from the commission itself. And those plans then could deal with things like sea level rise and how to adapt to it and try to protect wetlands that perform multiple functions in trying to deal with climate change and sea level rise. So there's a national program. There's also the EPA, the National Estuarine Research Program in NOAA, and the National Estuary Program in the EPA that can provide resources to try to make plans like this. It takes, I think the federal government could do something. I doubt whether it will, do anything in the next couple of years at least. They're focused on other things at the moment. Their Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior have a role, so there are some federal agencies that could be doing stuff. I mean, climate change and sea level rise are going to affect species and that are protected under federal laws. There are things that they could do too. I mean, there's creative ideas that you could come up with, but whether there's the political will to do it on a national basis, I don't know.